Today at the National Press Club, Attorney General Mark Dreyfus and AUSTRAC CEO Brendan Thomas. The pair will discuss the release of Australia's money laundering and terrorism financing national risk assessments. Mark Dreyfus and Brendan Thomas with today's National Press Club address.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club and the Westpac Address, where we're meeting on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, Canberra. My name is Laura Tingle, I'm the club's president. Online crime, whether it's your credit card being phished, hacks of computer systems, financing terrorism, or large-scale money laundering, seem to be a risk that none of us can avoid these days. The federal government has announced a range of initiatives since it came to office to deal with these problems, and has now turned its attention to updating the Anti-Money Laundering and Counter-Terrorism Financing Act. Attorney General Mark Dreyfus and the Chief Executive of the financial crime agency AUSTRAC, Brendan Thomas, are going to address us today on these plans. I'm sure my journalistic colleagues have questions for the AG on a range of other issues too. Please welcome Mr Dreyfus and Mr Thomas, and I invite Mr Dreyfus to speak to us first.
Thanks very much, Laura. Good afternoon, everyone. And can I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we meet, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I'd also acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here today. I'm proud to be here with AUSTRAC CEO Brendan Thomas to launch AUSTRAC's new national risk assessments. And I acknowledge the Secretary of the Attorney General's Department, Catherine Jones, PSM, the heads of the National Intelligence Community Agencies in my portfolio, Australian Federal Police Commissioner Reece Kershaw, APM, and Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission Chief Executive Officer Heather Cook. I also acknowledge the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions, Raylene Sharp, KC, as well as the Director General of the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, Mike Burgess, and other distinguished guests. It's a disturbing but inescapable fact that Australia is at serious risk of exploitation by criminals seeking to launder illicit funds. Each year, billions of dollars are generated from illegal activities such as drug trafficking, tax evasion, people smuggling, cybercrime, and arms trafficking. And we know that the proceeds from these crimes are used to fund further serious crimes such as terrorism, child abuse and human trafficking. Today's release of AUSTRAC's two new national risk assessments is vitally important. The National Risk Assessment on Terrorism Financing and the National Risk Assessment on Money Laundering are detailed assessments of the risks, threats, vulnerabilities and consequences of these crimes in Australia. We have strong and committed agencies, including AUSTRAC, taking up the fight against money laundering and terrorism financing. In recent years, AUSTRAC's work has led to severe penalties on businesses which have failed to ensure their services were not used for money laundering or to finance terrorism. These record-breaking penalties are a clear warning to businesses that the Australian government takes breaches of our money laundering legal framework seriously. Penalties are just one important element of this system. We must use all the tools available to us to combat the serious and harmful impacts of money laundering and the criminal activities it funds. AUSTRAC also provides vital help to our law enforcement and intelligence agencies, including the Australian Federal Police and the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission, which are dedicated to targeting money laundering and organised crime groups. This cooperation has had considerable success in recent years. Over the past 4 years, the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecution has secured more than 240 convictions for money laundering offences. Just last year, the AFP-led Criminal Assets Confiscation Task Force restrained criminal assets worth over $352 million, a staggering $214 million more than the previous year. real estate accounted for 65% of those assets. This is a concerning statistic, but it's not surprising. We know the laundering of large and illicit sums through real estate, both residential and commercial, is an established money laundering method in Australia. Catching and prosecuting these criminals is important. So is holding businesses to account when they're asleep at the wheel. But it is a far better outcome for us all if we can protect everyone in our community and prevent these crimes from occurring in the first place. The anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing regime is one of our best tools to protect businesses and individuals from criminal exploitation and to stop funds flowing to terrorist organisations and other criminal enterprises, strengthening our economy in the process. It has long concerned me that the former coalition government failed to keep our laws up to date. As a result, Australia is falling short of meeting the standards required to combat criminal abuse of our financial system and is at increased risk of becoming a haven for money laundering. It's now almost a decade since Australia was found to have significant deficiencies in our ability to combat money laundering and counter-terrorism financing. In 2015, the Financial Action Task Force, the global financial watchdog, found that Australia had failed to comply with a number of critical standards. In particular, Australia's failure to extend our anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing regime to tranche 2 entities, including lawyers, accountants and real estate agents, was singled out. This was followed by the former government's own review in 2016 that again found that there were a number of deficiencies in Australia's regime. This is the same government that was in power when it was revealed in 2017 that Westpac had breached anti-money laundering laws more than 23 million times. And yet, the former government still failed to act. Despite these clear warnings that our economy is at risk of being exploited by criminal gangs and terrorists, the former government dragged its heels and failed to do anything of substance for the entire 9 years it was in office. As I've stressed, money laundering underpins and enables many other forms of criminal activity. The former government allowed Australia to become vulnerable, a playground for organised crime. As a result of its failure to act, the former government has now put Australia at risk of being grey-listed by the Financial Action Task Force for failing to meet minimum global standards. This could have serious economic and reputational consequences. Australia was a founding member of the Financial Action Task Force in 1989, but is now one of just a handful of countries that are rated non-compliant because of our failure to regulate tranche 2 entities. In a separate report released today, the Financial Action Task Force has again singled out Australia for our continued non-compliance with global standards. While other countries strengthen their defences against the proceeds of criminal and corrupt business practices over the last decade, the former government left the door wide open for illicit funds to flood into Australia. The Albanese government has no tolerance for corruption or illicit financing of any kind. We're committed to strengthening the system to prevent perpetrators financing serious crimes like drug trafficking, child abuse, terrorism and organised crime. We're committed to regulating tranche 2 entities to prevent further abuse of our financial system. We are also committed to simplifying the regime to make it easier for business. We want to modernise the Anti-Money Laundering and Counter-Terrorism Financing Act to ensure that it keeps pace with the increasingly digital, instant nature of our global financial system, closing the gaps that we know increasingly sophisticated, professional criminal organisations can exploit. We demonstrated our commitment to this task in this year's budget with $166.4 million to implement these overdue reforms. This investment will enable AUSTRAC to implement the new simplified and expanded regime. This includes delivering comprehensive education and guidance to support Tranche 2 businesses. We're consulting closely with all interested stakeholders on these reforms. Last month, the Attorney General's Department concluded a second round of public consultation. 128 submissions were received and 43 targeted meetings with industry and government stakeholders have been held. I thank the many industry representatives who have welcomed these reforms. We will continue to work with all stakeholders to ensure the reforms are fit for purpose and that businesses are supported and equipped to detect and prevent criminals from misusing their services. Let me be very clear. Opposing these reforms means aiding and abetting the criminal abuse of our financial system by drug traffickers, people smugglers, terrorists and those who exploit and abuse children. Money laundering is not a victimless crime. We have to act. We cannot afford further delay. Money laundering allows criminals to profit from their offending. This is profit that can be reinvested to finance future crime, and so the criminal enterprise cycle continues. These criminals are constantly looking for new ways to exploit our systems and launder the proceeds of their crime through Australian real estate and our economy more generally. Opposing these reforms enables criminals to continue to engage in drug trafficking, terrorism and child exploitation and to profit from those serious crimes. No legitimate business wants any part of this. The critical need for these reforms is reinforced by the risk assessments being released today. The Money Laundering National Risk Assessment shows that criminals continue to exploit established and legal channels such as cash, luxury goods, real estate, domestic banks, casinos and remittance services to launder funds in Australia. The risk assessments also flag a variety of high and very high vulnerabilities that threaten the effectiveness of Australia's existing anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing regime. Brendan will speak on why the insights and risk assessments provided by AUSTRAC should be heeded by industry and used to inform their identification and management of money laundering and terrorism financing risks. Importantly, they send a clear signal about high-risk industries and the threats and vulnerabilities which need urgent attention. These crimes are occurring across Australia, and there are particular vulnerabilities in the industries included in the second tranche of our reforms. I'll mention a few examples. In the legal industry, there was a recent major crime investigation by the Queensland Crime and Corruption Commission into a Gold Coast law firm. 4 people were convicted of money laundering, fraud and drug offences for possessing and supplying cocaine. A court found that the law firm was knowingly paid using the proceeds of drug trafficking. In the real estate industry, there was an investigation by the Australian Federal Police and Victoria Police into an organised crime syndicate that resulted in 52 people being charged with money laundering, proceeds of crime and other offences. Assets worth over $47 million were seized, including 60 properties and income generated from rental properties. In a separate investigation, the Australian Federal Police seized more than 3,000 acres of Tasmanian farmland that was purchased by Chinese nationals using the proceeds of crime. In the accounting industry, AUSTRAC's risk assessment highlights a recent example where an accountant provided advice and assistance to a criminal syndicate on how to avoid bank triggers and alerts for funds entering the Australian financial system from overseas institutions. Accountants located offshore were also used to establish companies in their local jurisdictions, including shell companies, to obscure the source of the funds transferred into Australia. In conclusion, I want to thank Brendan and everyone at AUSTRAC for their continued work in safeguarding Australia from money laundering, terrorism financing and other serious crimes. I thank AUSTRAC's partners in law enforcement and intelligence agencies and at the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions. We are a decade overdue on essential reform to combat money laundering in Australia. It is now critical that we act. We need to stop the drug traffickers, terrorists and criminals who harm our children. We need to be vigilant about money laundering and terrorism financing risks and ensure that everyone does their part to stop these criminals from exploiting our economy to launder the proceeds of their crimes. It is time to give criminals a run for their money. There's a step there, Brendan.
Thank you, Attorney. And I acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land that we meet today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders and to their beautiful country. It's an honour to be here at the National Press Club to launch Australia's latest national risk assessments on money laundering and terrorism financing. These risk assessments form the basis of our understanding of the nature and the scale of money laundering and terrorism financing challenges in Australia. In addition to drawing on the expertise of AUSTRAC's own analysts, these assessments rely on the information sourced from public and private sector institutions, from 111 of our reporting entities and industry partners, from 35 international financial intelligence units, from examining over 3 years' worth of data from Commonwealth prosecutions, just over 1,200 prosecutions of money laundering offences, and looking at millions of data points in AUSTRAC's data holdings to look at trends, as well as assessments of our own and our partners' criminal intelligence. Due to time today, I'll focus specifically on money laundering. What the money laundering risk assessment shows us is that Australia's economy is exploited by money launderers. Lawful domestic financial channels remain fundamentally important pathways for money launderers to place, to layer and to integrate funds domestically and internationally. Our stable political system, our open and free economy, our independent legal system, our well-developed financial services sector and our strong real estate market make Australia a great place to do business. These features also make Australia an attractive destination to store and integrate criminal proceeds into the financial system. Drug offences are the single largest source of money laundered in Australia, but there's also significant money laundered from tax and revenue crimes, government-funded program fraud, proceeds of illicit tobacco sales, and the global proceeds of scams. Criminals are persistent in their exploitation of channels that have historically been used to launder funds, such as banks, remitters and casinos, as well as high-value assets such as luxury goods and real estate. Criminal use of digital currency exchanges, unregistered remitters and bullion dealers is increasing and posing greater risks. The increased speed of financial transactions in recent years has made it harder for financial institutions to identify and freeze suspicious transfers before funds leave an account. This is further complicated when individuals open and transact through multiple products across multiple financial institutions. The lack of money laundering controls in non-financial businesses is creating a significant hole that many criminals are simply walking straight through. The money being laundered in Australia is extensive. If we take just one type of crime alone, drug dealing, we know, through the good work of our colleagues at the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission, that the value of the Australian domestic drug market is at least $12.4 billion a year. That's $12.4 billion of illegal money. All that needs to be laundered through the Australian economy every year, and that's one single type of crime. A further specific money laundering threat is that a number of Australia's illicit markets are linked to criminal markets and organisations operating in Asia. These include large and highly functional international drug trafficking organisations that control supply chains into Australia, as well as highly organised and sophisticated professional international money laundering organisations that have a demonstrated capacity to launder funds into and out of Australia. Australia's extensive economic relations and trade with Asian markets also provide legitimate financial pathways that can mask illicit transfers, often through trade-based money laundering. The international trade system is subject to a number of vulnerabilities that can be exploited. Large volumes of global trade flows provide opportunities to obscure individual illicit transactions, especially when combined with foreign exchange transactions or diverse trade financing arrangements. To give you an example of the scale and sophisticated of money laundering operations, one such operation that was dismantled by the AFP in Australia operated as a criminal remittance and banking service, able to make significant sums of money available to clients almost anywhere in the world within 24 hours. The organisation moved an estimated $10 billion over 4 years and had the capacity to move up to $1 million an hour. It even set its own exchange rates. The organisation had a sophisticated informal value transfer system in place to make funds available overseas. By exploiting digital currency trading, domestic and foreign shell companies, multiple offshore bank accounts, the organisation effectively operated as an underground bank with global reach. Australia's major banks are almost certainly still exposed to significant money laundering risks. Australia's major banks have made substantial financial, technological and human investment in sophisticated anti-money laundering programs, and they contribute vast amounts of reporting to AUSTRAC that's shared and used by law enforcement agencies throughout Australia. These efforts have made it harder for criminal organisations to launder money through major banks. Nevertheless, the size of these banks' customer base, the scale of their operations, the scale of their cash transactions and their global reach means they're still exposed to significant money laundering risks. Financial remittance service providers, especially unregistered service providers, pose high money laundering risks. Despite concerted law enforcement attention, unregistered remitters continue to operate in Australia and often feature in large-scale money laundering investigations. In some instances, strong links exist between unregistered remitters and international money laundering organisations. 18 months ago, the AFP investigated a highly sophisticated global criminal organisation suspected of operating and controlling one of Australia's largest independently owned remittance businesses. The organisation used vast scale of the remittance business to help mask the movement of at least $229 million in criminal proceeds into and out of Australia. Unlike other money laundering organisations that prefer to operate covertly, this syndicate was uniquely overt, operating legitimate shopfronts across the country. In addition to servicing thousands of legitimate customers, it also serviced criminal customers, including helping to create fake business documents, invoices and bank statements to avoid regulatory detection. The investigations resulted in arrests and restraining orders relating to more than $50 million in residential and investment properties. The purchase of luxury goods and bullion continues to pose high money laundering vulnerabilities. Criminals use luxury goods to both store and transfer criminal proceeds. In Australia, high-value watches, jewellery, designer accessories and apparel are commonly identified in money laundering investigations. Luxury goods are attractive for money laundering for a range of reasons. In particular, they're easily obtained and easily transported. Fraud against the Australian taxation system is a significant source of laundered funds in Australia. We estimated that tax fraud could increase to over $1 billion annually. In a joint ATO and AFP investigation into a large-scale tax fraud and money laundering scheme, the investigation involved a syndicate that conspired to withhold and launder $105 million owed to the ATO. Illicitly obtained funds were invested in luxury assets, including a boat, cars, motorbikes and even an aeroplane. A legitimate payroll company run by the syndicate members accepted money from legitimate clients to process payroll, transferring funds to subcontracted companies which made payroll payments to workers of their clients. Those companies were fronts with straw directors but controlled by syndicate members. These companies partially remitted tax obligations to the ATO but redirected remaining funds through a complex series of companies and trusts to accounts controlled by syndicate members. The methods used include the use of separate foreign secrecy jurisdictions for banking and company incorporation, the use of corporate vehicles including trusts and shell companies, the use of multiple professional facilitators including solicitors, accountants and company and service providers, and the use of false invoices to disguise funds transferred as loans. Digital currencies are increasingly being used to allow criminal groups to move funds across borders quickly, cheaply and pseudonymously. Digital currency as a means to transfer value is a complementary channel to traditional and entrenched money laundering channels. It's growing quickly and its use becoming ever more sophisticated in moving money between jurisdictions. Quick trades through multiple digital exchanges and digital currencies in unregulated jurisdictions, with funds then appearing in legitimate banks in less regulated jurisdictions, make it hard for Australian financial institutions to trace the true source of these funds. We are seeing ongoing risks in a number of enabling functions that still lie outside Australia's money laundering framework. Lawyers can facilitate money laundering, including unwittingly, through the provision of their professional services. Law enforcement agencies are consistently identifying criminals who seek out and exploit the advice and services of lawyers to legitimise their activity and obfuscate the proceeds of crime. Domestic criminals rely on lawyers, who often work alongside other professionals such as accountants, financial advisors and offshore service providers to conceal illicit funds and beneficial ownership. In one instance involving more than $100 million of taxation fraud, a partner at a law firm used his access to the practice's trust account to knowingly launder over $24 million in criminal proceeds from the syndicate's activities. He created a false document trail using straw directors to authorise trust distributions. Separately, an accountant became a critical trusted advisor to the same syndicate. He misused his firm's trust account to counter criminal proceeds and supply funds to co-conspirators. He facilitated fund transfers through fraudulent companies, committed legal document fraud and destroyed evidence. We rate real estate as posing a very high risk of money laundering in Australia. We see property purchases consistently in our financial intelligence as a way for organised criminals and transnational organised crime to store wealth in Australia. We've seen examples of people associated with organised crime managing significant real estate portfolios, using professional facilitators to manage those portfolios. Significant property purchases are repeatedly appearing in financial intelligence and in law enforcement operations. Even a single example of an overseas family with members on an Interpol red list buying over $750 million worth of Australian commercial and residential real estate, including a single cash-based property purchase of over $30 million. While this sector remains outside Australia's money laundering regulation, it will remain a very attractive means for criminal groups globally to launder money and to store their wealth and continue to allow those who profit from drug and human trafficking, child exploitation and international frauds to profit from their crime. These risk assessments we're launching today show the scale, the ingenuity and the overall threat that money laundering and terrorism financing presents to Australia. They highlight the challenges facing us all, posed by rapid developments in technology, payment and financial systems and the ongoing criminal opportunities. They show that despite huge law enforcement and industry effort, without greater statutory coverage of all money laundering risks and the passage of the proposed AML reforms, Australia will remain an attractive location for international criminals to move and store their wealth. I encourage you to take the time to read these assessments, including online at austrac.gov.au, and together we can make further inroads into disrupting money laundering and terrorism financing. Thank you.
Thank you both for that. Let's take it back a step for people who aren't involved in criminal activities like me. I just want to clarify, you said that we hadn't engaged in that tranche 2 and were being criticised a decade ago, but I'm just not quite clear whether we have moved into tranche 2, but where the shortcomings are. I mean, this is people like real estate agents, lawyers, accountants. But they are being prosecuted. So what are the rules governing that tranche 2 group now, and what would it be under the new model that you're looking at?
We need to legislate to bring in tranche 2 entities who are, as you just said, Laura, accountants, real estate agents, lawyers, gem traders and a few more smaller professions. It's something that Australia should have done 10 years ago, and we are, as I said in my remarks, we're at risk of being grey-listed if we don't get on with it. So it has to happen. The status quo is absolutely not an option, and we're one of a handful of countries remaining in the world who have not legislated to bring in these kinds of entities.
And what would be their obligations?
I might hand to Brendan on that.
So Australia's money laundering regime applies largely to financial institutions at the moment. And those obligations are based on a set of international standards enforced by a group called the Financial Action Task Force, the international body that sets money laundering standards. And there are a range of those standards, including understanding your customer, understanding the risk of money laundering to your business or the industry that you're in, and putting in place a range of controls to mitigate that risk. And there's also a range of reporting obligations on those organisations that are covered by our money laundering regime to provide us with data on cash transactions over $10,000, international funds transfers, but most importantly, to identify suspicious activity and report that activity. So to understand the risk, and when they're seeing activity that's breaching that risk, to do something about reporting about it. And for those bodies that fail to implement those standards, there are sanctions, and we've talked a little bit about some of those sanctions and the fines that are being imposed. For the tranche 2 entities that are proposed to come under that money laundering regime, they would have the same requirements, but at a lesser scale. So the level of transactions a major bank does, for instance, are hundreds of thousands a day. We get 500,000 international funds transfer instructions a day coming to us from the banks. Like, the volume is incredible. But for a real estate business, an accountancy firm and a law firm, it's nowhere near that level of compliance in terms of volumes. But what they would be required to do is to understand their customers, to understand the money laundering risk as it poses to their business, and to put in place some strategies to mitigate that risk. And those strategies include understanding who they're dealing with and making sure they're confident they know who they're dealing with, making sure they're confident they know where the source of funds are coming from that they're dealing with and where those funds are going to. And if that client or customer is posing increased risk, taking greater diligence around managing that transaction. And if they're concerned that they're seeing something suspicious, reporting that suspicion to us. And indeed, if they're concerned that they're dealing with something that might be criminal, they should think about whether to continue with that kind of transaction. So it's really about putting controls around risk and not turning a blind eye to crime that might be in front of you.
Thanks. Ron Misen has a question.
Thank you. Attorney, I just wanted to ask you, firstly, when do you expect these laws to be introduced, and are you confident you'll get them through before the Parliament's prorogued ahead of the election? And similarly, could you give us a bit of an update about where you're at on privacy reform as well, just on the timeline for that? And Mr Thomas, can I just ask you, one of the significant and growing risks in your report is related to government services fraud. Can you just give us a bit more detail? What government services are being targeted, and can you give us an idea of the scale in relation to that government services fraud?
The short answer is on this tranche 2 change as soon as possible. We need to get on with it. I've just completed the second round of consultation, which I've outlined in the speech, and as soon as I can bring this to the Parliament, having considered the last remaining parts of that consultation, we will. On privacy, similarly, I'm looking forward to bringing that to the Parliament as soon as I can. We announced a response to the review of the Privacy Act, which I accelerated at the start of this year, and I'm very hopeful that we will bring that to the Parliament later this year. Brendan? In
terms of government services fraud, we've seen a number of prosecutions over recent years where organised crime have been involved in exploiting government-funded programs. We've seen at a state level frauds in disaster recovery schemes. We've seen frauds in the childcare system, fake childcare centres established by organised crime and money flowing through that. We've seen frauds of the NDIS system. It's those kinds of frauds that we're seeing. We've recently got some funds from the government in the recent budget to increase our intelligence capability to assist understanding the nature of those frauds so that we can bring more of that intelligence to law enforcement attention and help those agencies that are experiencing that fraud get on top of it.
Can I just follow up on Ron's question about the legislation? There's been a lot of talk about the fact that it's actually quite difficult to, you've got a logjam of legislation and there's also a bit of a delay because of a shortage of parliamentary draftsmen. Is that an issue? And, when you say as soon as possible, what's a realistic time frame just logistically to get stuff into Parliament?
My aim is before the end of this year.
And is it a problem?
It's true, we have been a legislatively active government. As far as possible, I'm hoping that Parliamentary Council, for whom I am responsible, are not the cause of any logjam. There's only so much that the Parliament can get through in a given year, whether or not there's enough drafting. And we've got a busy legislative program coming up starting in August.
Sure. Rosie Lewis.
Rosie Lewis from the Australian Attorney-General, just on being legislatively active. The draft religious discrimination laws remain in a stalemate. You have said you're awaiting a response from the Coalition. They say they won't negotiate with you until you consider serious concerns from religious groups. So where to from here? Will you try and find a path forward with the Coalition and those religious groups? Or can you clarify, are the reforms dead in this Parliament?
Well, we've said right from the start that we're looking for an enduring reform here. We're looking to give protections to staff and students in religious schools and protections to people of faith, and working on that notion of getting an enduring reform. I gave to the opposition, to Mr Dutton and Senator Cash back in March, the bills that we hope to bring to the Parliament. We are still awaiting a response from the opposition. I don't count the public statements that Senator Cash has made as a response because she's actually refused to engage. We are waiting for line-by-line type of engagement. That's what normally should occur. That's the response that we gave to the former Morrison government when we were in opposition, when they brought a bill to the Parliament. I'm waiting for that kind of engagement. It hasn't happened yet. And the reason for wanting to make sure that there is bipartisan approval of what we bring to the Parliament is that we don't want a Religious Discrimination Act in Australia that is subject to change on a change of government.
Assuming that you don't get the line-by-line response without responding to the religious groups, is it your judgment it is just too difficult? Will the Labor government take a promise to the next election to pursue it in the next term?
We think this is worth doing. That's why we voted in favour of a religious discrimination bill in February of 2022. That's why we moved amendments to that bill, some of which were successful because Liberal members of Parliament in the Morrison government crossed the floor. This is an unfinished project.
Ben Westcott.
Thank you very much for your speech, Minister Dreyfus and Mr Thomas. Thank you so much for that. You said in your speech, Mr Dreyfus, that penalties are just one element. We need to use all tools available to us to combat money laundering. Surely one of the tools available to us is a fully actualised whistleblower protection system. Just the consultation for the second stage of your whistleblower reforms concluded in December last year, and 1 month after that, Transparency Australia gave us, or Transparency International, sorry, gave us a score which is about 10 points behind where we were a decade ago. Transparency International Australia said delivering on a whistleblower protection authority is one of the next steps to restoring Australia's anti-corruption reputation. So where are we up to with the second stage of whistleblower reforms, and do you think you'll conclude them before the next election?
Well, sorry to strike a familiar theme, but this is another area where the former government didn't act. I brought the Public Interest Disclosure Act to the Parliament in 2013 in my first go as Attorney-General. And I'm very proud of that piece of legislation. And to make sure that it was as fit for purpose as possible, we wrote into that legislation a statutory review. That statutory review was required to be carried out by the former government. They got Philip Moss, an eminent Australian public servant, to do the review. He did the review. He made over 30 recommendations in 2016, and that's where it sat. When we came to government, the former government had done nothing for 6 years. I brought a first round of reforms that were urgent, arising from Philip Moss's report. They needed to be done in time for the commencement of the National Anti-Corruption Commission. That happened, and as you've rightly said in your question, we've had there's a second round coming. We've had consultation about that. We are considering and continuing to consider what will be the form of the further reforms, which we've acknowledged are needed, that we bring to the Parliament.
But do we have a timeline on that at all?
Soon.
Andrew Tillett.
Andrew Tillett from the Financial Review and also director here at the Press Club. Before we began today's broadcast, there was an acknowledgement of the Afghanistan ambassador. He's here in the audience, effectively an ambassador in exile since the return of the Taliban there in Kabul. So I'd like to ask about the Office of Special Investigator, looking at war crimes. The office has been going for 4 years now. There's only been one charge laid against one former Special Forces soldier in that period. In that time, though, we've had obviously the Ben Roberts-Smith defamation trial. I appreciate it's a civil matter versus criminal, so there's a lower burden of proof in that case. But are you disappointed or frustrated at all that there's only been the one case that has sort of been the one charge that has been laid? And how committed is the government to ensuring the office continues its work, or is it getting to the point where it's all just getting sort of too hard and there really won't be any other further prosecutions to come from this office?
I can say very directly the government is fully committed to the Office of the Special Investigator. That's why the Office of the Special Investigator has been funded in successive budgets. You've rightly identified that only as yet one person has been charged, and I'm not going to comment further on whether or not there will be further charges, but it would be apparent to anyone in this room who's familiar with the Brereton Report, the published version of the Brereton Report, the degree of difficulty that there is in war crimes investigations. That said, I think Australia can be very proud of the fact that we are one of the very few countries in the world that has embarked on war crimes prosecutions of our own servicemen. And it remains work in progress.
Thank you.
Dominic Giannini.
Hi, thank you both for your speeches. Dominic Giannini from the Australian Associated Press. Just first to Mr Thomas, I just want to ask about Pacific banking, seeing as that's topical over the past few days. Do we have to work with our Pacific neighbours, and how do we work with our Pacific neighbours to ensure that illicit funds don't just get transferred offshore? And to the Attorney-General, I just wanted to ask, in the debate about the Middle East, we hear the suffix and the prefix Muslim minister, Muslim MPs, Jewish MPs. Should this be used at all, or should a religion of an MP not be relevant to their stance on human rights? And does it just encourage pigeonholing?
I'll let Brendan answer the first question.
We do work.
While I think about the answer to the second question.
I'll talk for a long time too. We do work extensively with our Pacific neighbours for a number of reasons. One, it's a very good thing to do. Secondly, I mentioned that Australia is exposed to money laundering risks, not just from criminal proceeds generated in Australia, but those generated in our region that might be flowing into Australia. We work very closely with all of our Pacific neighbours in building capacity for them. AUSTRAC runs training programs for financial intelligence units right across the Pacific. We've got a number of them running this year. We provide software services to Pacific countries so that they can track financial payments amongst one another much more effectively. And we bring those Pacific financial intelligence units together in a group called PFIC, the Pacific Financial Intelligence Community. And through that community, we share learnings around money laundering. We develop particular activities around targeting particular money laundering groups, about strengthening anti-money laundering activities across the Pacific. There's a very strong, coherent group of Pacific money laundering bodies trying to tackle money laundering throughout the Pacific. The challenge is they're very small. So AUSTRAC's a reasonably large organisation. We've got a couple of hundred people doing financial intelligence. Some of these Pacific countries have got 2 or 3 people doing that kind of financial intelligence. So we're doing everything we possibly can to try and strengthen their arm, increase their capability, give them technology if they need that technology, and provide professional development for the Pacific financial intelligence units to be able to combat money laundering as they see it. And it's a good thing for us to do to help our neighbours become stronger, and it's a good thing for us to do because we can stop the flows of money coming to Australia if we can have a stronger Pacific.
And just to reinforce what Brendan said, it's something that the government is committed to doing, to helping our Pacific neighbours. Many of them have reached out and asked for assistance. AUSTRAC is not a gigantic organisation, but it is a lot bigger than anything that the Pacific Island countries have got. and we're very happy to assist, and we aim to continue to do this. It's something that Australia can really offer to our Pacific neighbours, and we intend to go on doing that. On your question about whether or not members of parliament or ministers should be labelled, I'm proud to be Jewish. I'm a Jewish Australian. You could give me some other labels as well. I'm proud to have been a lifelong member of the Australian Labor Party. But, and many of my colleagues will often have the adjective. People will say, she is a Muslim member of parliament, or he is a Muslim member of parliament, or he is a staunch Catholic, or she is a staunch Catholic, or he's a Protestant, or all sorts of labels get attributed. I think there's nothing wrong with identifying that people are members of particular groups in our community. In my case, I would hope it informs the way I live, that it gives me a moral framework to live by. But it's not determinative. And the problem, which you probably are adverting to in the question there, is that when it becomes determinative, or it is seen as absolutely directing someone because they bear that label, then we fall into error. One of the great things about Australia is that people can be members of a vast range of different organisations and groups and have a range of beliefs, but we get on and we don't allow labels to define everything that we do. So I don't think there's anything per se wrong with identifying people's religion or identifying that people belong to particular groups or have particular ethnic backgrounds. What's wrong is when we assume, and this is prejudice and discrimination, that is determinative of their views or determinative of the way they'll vote or determinative of the way that they will behave in society. Australia's a much richer place and a much more diverse place than that, and that's where, if you like, prejudice and discrimination start.
Thank you.
Melissa Code.
Hello, Melissa Code from the Mandarin. I have a question for each of you respectively. Mr. Thomas, there's a reference in the documents distributed today about the difficulty capturing how much money is being laundered in the Australian economy and also the scope and extent of the social harms. I'm wondering if there's any work being done to sort of refine or get better at understanding the landscape, so to speak. And Attorney General, on Sunday, it marked 1 year since the Robo-Debt Royal Commission report was handed to government. There are some in the community, or many, according to my readers, who would say restorative justice has not been fulfilled as yet. A sense of accountability is not palpable as yet. I'd love you to just remark on the sort of wash of consequences post-Royal Commission and what that looks like to a Labor government who really championed this Royal Commission.
I'll go first if you like. It's always difficult predicting the volume of unreported crime. Money laundering is the same as many other types of crime, and we understand the crime that gets reported and the crime that gets prosecuted. It's often difficult to assess the crime that isn't. In the money laundering area, we've got a couple of examples of where we've got some great examples of where we can start to get at least some indication of the cost of money laundering. I talked about the great work the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission does. They do wastewater analysis every year, which looks and analyses wastewater. An awful thought, but someone's got to do it, and they do a great job at it. And through that analysis, they can get a good picture of the volume of drug use, the volume of individual drug use, the mix of the types of drugs that people are using. And from that can make some strong estimates on the total volume of drug use in Australia. Using that information along with what we know about drug markets, we can get an estimation of the total cost of drugs in Australia, which they come out with $12.4 billion. So in that type of crime, we've got a reasonably good picture. Our colleagues at the Australian Institute of Criminology have also done some great work in recent years in a cost of crime report, estimating the costs of different kinds of crime and the money that might be flowing from those. And that report looks at a whole host of different categories of crime and what the total cost of those crimes might be. It is very difficult to get that kind of picture. And from our point of view, one of the challenges in regulating this type of environment is trying to understand the displacement that might occur once one sector becomes stronger and criminals look for other areas to launder funds through. And particularly one of the great susceptibilities of the Australian market is a place for international criminals to launder funds. And so what we want is to make it harder for them to place their money here so they go look someplace else, to be quite frank. So that money doesn't enter our economy in the first place. And so that we don't have to measure the volume of international funds that are being laundered through Australia, because it's harder for them to do that. And it displaces to another place or to another time. But it is quite difficult to look at, but we do have some good indications of the volume of money coming through the Australian economy.
And on your question about robo-debt, we moved swiftly when we came to government to establish a Royal Commission, which is always an unusual thing to do. We aimed for it to be a very short and sharp Royal Commission, and it was, and the report could not have been more direct. It exposed what occurred here, which was that hundreds of thousands of Australians suffered grievously as a result of the illegal conduct of the former government. There were suicides and some people's lives were permanently ruined, and we're not going to get them back. We're not going to be able to make good to those families, and we're not going to be able to absolutely repair the lives of some people whose lives were damaged. But there have been hundreds of millions of dollars in compensation paid by the Commonwealth Government. We've had a successful class action brought against the Commonwealth Government as a result of that illegality. And I would like to think that the Robo-Debt Royal Commission remains there as an absolutely salutary warning to Australian public servants and future Australian governments that when an act of the Australian Parliament directs certain things occur, that has to be obeyed, because that was the problem, that there was clear legislation, but successive ministers directed that legislation not be followed. That was all exposed in the Royal Commission.
I'm satisfied with the AG about the accountability piece and what that means for justice.
The report held people accountable and named people as accountable. There is still disciplinary proceedings occurring within the processes of the Australian Public Service, so we're not quite done. And I think you should keep asking the question.
I will.
Maybe ask me again in a year's time, but we're not quite done. Thank you.
Dana Daniel.
Dana Daniel from the Canberra Times. Thank you both for your speech. My question's for the Attorney-General. Do you support raising the age of criminal responsibility for Commonwealth offences from 10 to at least 14?
This is something that's being looked at in the Standing Council of Attorneys-General now. It's something that's still under consideration at the Commonwealth level. Some states have moved on this. Notably, in some territories, the ACT has already legislated, the NT has legislated, Victoria is on the point of legislation, and I would say that it's of slightly lesser urgency for the Commonwealth. We have no children that are presently convicted of Commonwealth criminal offences, and most Commonwealth criminal offences, in fact, overwhelmingly Commonwealth criminal offences, are not likely to catch a child.
You've recently moved to create a new Commonwealth offence that is likely to involve children, and that's around deepfakes. There are also calls for you to take a leadership role as the Federal Attorney-General, and this is something that's been on the Council of Attorney-General's agenda for many years now. Do you think that the age should be raised?
Well, I'm going to say it's going to remain under consideration. But you're not quite right, sorry to be a lawyer, but on the deepfake amendments to the criminal code, they do not deal with child sex abuse material. There are separate provisions of the criminal code.
That's in relation to the victim, not the alleged offender.
You're right, potentially an alleged offender could be under the age of 14. We would hope not, but it's possible.
So should they be charged as an adult?
No.
No.
And they wouldn't be charged as an adult. The age of criminal responsibility raises a different question. Children in Australian courts are dealt with in children's courts. The age of criminal responsibility raises a different question, which is whether a child or someone of a certain age can ever be held criminally responsible. In Australian courts, under the age of 10, you can't be, and now we are moving in some jurisdictions to, as it's put, raise the age.
Isabel Rowe.
Thank you both for your speeches. Isabel Rowe from the ABC. Just on the matter you both spoke about today, how often do you think that the real estate industry is knowingly taking proceeds of crime, and how will you enforce any rules to stop that? And how much of an impact do you think, if any, this is having on Australia's extraordinarily high property prices?
I might go first. We don't. One of the problems caused by the tranche 2 entities, including real estate agents, not being currently covered by the regime, is that we simply don't know the correct answer to your question. On occasion, real estate agents have been discovered to be involved and have been charged with criminal offences, but the full extent we don't know. On the property price question, there is no evidence directly about the impact. There's anecdotal suggestions that criminals pay inflated prices for real estate in Australia, which would have potentially an obvious impact on raising overall property prices. There's been some work done in Canada, which is directly to that effect, that there's been an increase in property prices because of money laundering through real estate. So I'll hand to Brendan because he may have some data or at least some better idea than I do, but I know from all that I've read that we don't really know in the real estate industry.
Yeah, the attorney's right, we don't really know in the real estate industry, and it's difficult to speculate what's in the mind of people conducting a real estate transaction. We do see, as the attorney said, prosecutions where real estate agents are actively involved in crime. There's certainly that case. But I think what's true to say is for real estate agents being outside the current regime, there's no cause for them to even ask the question. So if someone turns up, I gave an example earlier of someone paying for a property in Sydney with cash of more than $30 million. In the current arrangements, there's no requirement to ask where that money's come from, to properly attest to the person that's buying that property, to understand who the beneficial owner of that transaction actually is. If they come under this regime, they'll have to ask those questions, and they'll have to understand the nature of who they're dealing with and be assured themselves of where their funds are actually coming from. That is, if they're under the money laundering regime, it'll be impossible to turn a blind eye to crime. At the moment, it's possible to turn that blind eye.
Rania Yallop.
Rania Yallop, SBS. I've got a question each as well. The government announced an anti-Semitism envoy this morning. Will you adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, and does the government consider criticism of Israel to be anti-Semitic? And for Brendan, these accounting, law, real estate businesses are quite a bit smaller than banks are. Does AUSTRAC have a role to play in supporting those businesses with this additional regulation?
Just on the announcement by the Prime Minister and the Minister for Immigration, Mr Giles, this morning on the creation of an envoy to combat anti-Semitism, I want to say how immensely pleased I am with the announcement because I know that Gillian Siegel, who has been appointed to this job, from her long record of public service, including some pretty senior Commonwealth positions and senior positions in private enterprise, is going to make a difference. He's going to do a tremendous job. It's concrete action. It's something that's being done to deal with what has been an unprecedented rise in anti-Semitism in Australia, a shocking rise in anti-Semitism in Australia. I'm really pleased to see that we've hit upon something that 31 other countries around the world already have, which is an envoy to combat anti-Semitism. I met with the excellent American envoy to combat anti-Semitism, Deborah Lipstadt, in Washington in January of this year. So I'm pleased that this has occurred. I think I'll take a leaf out of Gillian Siegel's book. She was asked at the press conference this morning whether the government should adopt the IRA definition, and she said she's going to be giving that consideration and give advice to the government about it. I will await her advice. And on your last point, is criticism of Israel anti-Semitic? It absolutely can be. Not always. I criticise the government of Israel from time to time. I don't think I'm anti-Semitic. Other people criticise the government of Israel and I don't think they're anti-Semitic. But when people are singling out Israel and applying a standard to Israel that they do not apply to other countries, then potentially there's anti-Semitism going on.
To your tranche 2 question, one of the things that does characterise the tranche 2 entities is that so many of them are small businesses. I'm incredibly conscious of that as their potential future regulator. And we're not interested in regulation for the sake of regulation. The whole purpose of this is to try and close the door to crime and strengthen all of our institutions against organised crime. So we have an incredibly strong role to play in educating those sectors of the industry around money laundering and around their money laundering risk, in making sure we work hand in glove with them in how we design a new regulatory scheme so it's working with business in the most efficient and effective way, making sure that we understand the current requirements, other requirements that are on those businesses. So where people might be performing activities that are going to otherwise mean they're compliant with money laundering regulations, we don't ask them to do the same thing twice, that we just lift the standards or in fact accept the standards that they might have as part of other regulatory practices. And my commitment is to work hand in glove with all of those industries and the industry associations once the legislation passes in designing the regulatory elements of this scheme to make sure that it is really fit for purpose. And we're not just ticking boxes on compliance, but we're working in partnership, as we do with a lot of our financial institutions, to really shut out organised crime.
And if I could add to what Brendan said, there's $166 million in the budget. Part of it is for education of the tranche 2 entities, working with consultation and an education program to make sure that we have the most effective regulation possible. And as I said in my speech, I do thank the professional associations, the Law Council of Australia, the Law Societies of Australia, the 3 accounting organisations, real estate organisations for their work in the consultation, for talking to us about what this scheme needs to look like. So I'm very confident we're going to get there. I'm hoping we get there as soon as possible, but I do know that it's going to be after a very long and effective consultation.
Could I just get a bit of clarification on that comment, Attorney, about about Israel versus anti-Semitism, and saying that it can be when Israel is singled out and in a way that doesn't apply to other countries. Can you just elaborate on what you meant there?
When people apply to Israel a standard that is not applied to other countries, then potentially it's anti-Semitism. When people deny to Israel its right to exist, when people pretend that Israel was not created by the United Nations in 1948 and is absolutely a full member of the United Nations. Those sorts of things, I can go on, but I'd be giving you a long list of anti-Semitic approaches to Israel. I'd say again, as a matter of principle, when people criticise Israel in a way that they would not dream of applying to another country, then you are at the point of anti-Semitism.
So it's about approaches to Israel as opposed to actions by Israel.
Well, the question was directed at when is criticism of Israel anti-Semitism?
Sure.
And I'm saying there absolutely can be criticism of Israel which is anti-Semitism.
Well, we've covered a very vast range of topics this afternoon. Thank you both once again for your speeches, and thank you to the journalists for asking very interesting questions, and thank you to everyone here today.